Good evening, everybody. Here we are in April, and finally we've got some spring-like weather, which is just wonderful. Now, April is Stress Awareness Month in the UK, so it's a really important time, I feel, to revisit the impact that stress has on our body. Now, this is a two-part live that I'm doing. So tonight I am going to be talking about the impact that stress has on our health in so many different ways. But I do want you to not sort of be bogged down with the impact. I think it's really important to have awareness of just how stress does affect us. But equally, what is important is that we build into our day-to-day lives techniques that help us to manage stress and help us cope better and help to bring the body back into balance and calm it. And next week, I'm going to be talking about my 5 favorite naturopathic techniques that I use in my life to help me stay in control of stress rather than stress controlling me all the time. So let's get going and talk about how stress affects our life in so many different ways. Now, we all know that stress is not a good thing, but stress, of course, is actually important. It's known as our fight or flight response. So if there was an immediate danger, then it's really important that the body is able to respond to it, release adrenaline. We get a surge of adrenaline. I mean, if you were had to apply your brakes suddenly, you needed to suddenly brake your car quickly, you would get a surge of adrenaline, your heart might start beating faster. Now, that response, that immediate, quick response to danger is so important to our survival as human beings. And going back to when we were cavemen, of course, what we always think about is this fight or flight response, running away from danger, release of adrenaline, heart beats faster, lungs are going to work faster to move oxygen around the body. Your pupils will get larger. There's more glucose available in order to help us fight or flight. So we've got that energy that we need. But of course, the stress response should be turned off after a short period of time. The problem in the modern world, this 21st century curse of our lifestyles, is that for too many people, this stress response does not properly get switched off. And therefore, we go from being in that short-term fight or flight, short burst of adrenaline to a longer-term stress response that involves the long-term release of cortisol. And it's when we get this long-term release of cortisol that it has a real impact on our health and on our body. And it's those things that I want to talk about. Now, before I do that, just to briefly say, when we think about stress, it's emotional stress, of course. It's things that we may worry about, whether it's finances or relationship, but it goes beyond that. It's to do with an infection. That is a stress response to the body. If you've had surgery, that creates a trauma to the body. So it's our general busyness in our lives when we're trying to pack in too much that becomes an overwhelm, thinking about how we're going to get everything done. All of these things have an impact, create stress in our body. And this longer term impact, of course, has an impact on the release of cortisol that doesn't get turned off. Now, of course, some of us are going to have periods in our life when we are stressed. We may be experiencing grief, separation, something is going on in our lives. It is a significant lifetime event, but we need to pay very close attention to all these other aspects and to think about how we can find ways to manage it, which I will talk about next week. But I think it is important to understand how stress affects us in our day-to-day lives when it is not turned off. First of all, it can contribute to weight gain and fat storage. Of course, fat storage means that if we're trying to lose weight and we're very stressed, we may struggle to lose weight, even though we might be thinking we're doing all the right things. Of course, what happens when we're stressed and we get the release of adrenaline and then cortisol, like I said, we get a subsequent surge of glucose into the bloodstream. And that, if it's happening repeatedly, can trigger the release of excess insulin. Insulin will try and utilize that glucose. If it's not needed by our cells, it will end up converting that not just back into stores of glycogen for future glucose, it can end up being stored as fat and fat around the abdomen. And what we know about insulin is there's too much of it, is insulin becomes a hormone that promotes fat storage and inhibits fat breakdown. So if you're trying to lose weight, it can become particularly difficult at this time. The other thing that can happen when we stress is, and I'll talk about this again throughout these various points, is that we can end up choosing bad dietary choices that is not going to help in our goals and our aims to lose weight. The second thing to talk about is collagen. Cortisol can have a real impact on our collagen production. Now, why do we need collagen? Collagen is part of our cartilage makeup. Cartilage is to do with tendons and ligaments and bones and our skin. So when we're trying to take care of all aspects of our health, we need to pay particular attention to collagen. And what has been found out is that as cortisol levels rise, collagen production may start to decrease. Now, we can take collagen supplements. That's one thing that we can do, but it's having an understanding that by being under long-term stress, it can affect our skin elasticity. We may look more tired and drawn anyway, but we may be more prone to injury. So if you're doing exercise, you may be more prone to picking up injuries or a slower recovery to injury because there's a lack of collagen in order to repair our tendons or our ligaments, for example. And longer term, as we get older, it could have an impact on our bone strength, particularly for ladies needing to take care of our bones into later life. The stress could have an impact on collagen. Of course, collagen is needed for bones. The third thing I want to talk about is blood pressure. So I don't think it's any surprise for people. They'll often say, I've been under a lot of stress and my blood pressure has increased. One of the reasons for this, of course, is that when we want that fight or flight response to kick in, and we need to really encourage the movement of blood through the bloodstream, that can put additional pressure on our arteries and can temporarily increase our blood pressure, but longer term, it could just keep our blood pressure too high. Of course, coming back to our dietary choices, if we're stressed, we may be reaching for more coffee, these caffeinated drinks. Caffeine in turn creates an additional stress response in the body, and our overall dietary choices may not be great. And these things collectively will not be beneficial when we're trying to manage our blood pressure. The next thing on my list is overall metabolic health. There's a lot of talk about maintaining and managing our metabolic health. Blood pressure, cardiovascular disease comes into this, but first and foremost, we're thinking about how we need to take care and manage our blood sugar levels. I've talked about the surge of glucose and insulin as a result of the stress response, and yo-yoing blood sugar levels is really not conducive to maintaining good metabolic balance. We can end up developing insulin resistance, and longer term, this can lead to type 2 diabetes, for example. So we have to be very mindful through our dietary choices, but also being aware of the impact of stress can contribute to the development of these risk factors, these metabolic risk factors. Poor sleep habits. Now, cortisol is associated with stress, and rightly so, and particularly this long-term stress. But what many people don't appreciate is that the cortisol is needed as part of our natural circadian rhythm. So cortisol is part and parcel of our natural get up and go in the morning. When we wake up in the morning, cortisol within 30 minutes should be at the highest levels that it will be during the day. It gives us our natural get up and go. And this gradually declines as the day goes on. So when it's time for bed, cortisol is at its lowest level at that point of time, helps us to unwind, helps us to get ready for sleep and staying asleep and getting to sleep. Now, when we're under a lot of stress, more chronic stress, and we've got this cortisol being pumped out on a regular basis to respond to stress, then it can really upset this natural circadian rhythm, this natural cycle of cortisol being high in the morning and low at night. And what I find with clients, particularly when we test cortisol patterns over the course of the day, which we can do with simple saliva tests, which is a great way to see what's going on with your natural cortisol patterns. We may sometimes find that cortisol is not very high in the morning. It may flatline during the day, which makes us feel really tired. We're tired when we get up in the morning. We don't feel rested. We don't feel awake. We don't have that get up and go. And sometimes for people, what I see is that cortisol can start to rise at night when it should be at its lowest level. And sometimes people may struggle to unwind at night and struggle to get to sleep because this natural cortisol pattern has just got all over the place. So that's one way that stress can impact our natural circadian rhythms, our ability to get up in the morning and go to sleep when we want to go to sleep. It definitely has an impact on digestion. So when we think of the stress response, this fight or flight, that's part of what we call our sympathetic arm of our autonomic nervous system. But the other side to that, the opposite, the parasympathetic, is known as rest and digest, and known as that for good reason. Because when we're in the fight or flight, our non-essential functions are inhibited, and digestion is inhibited when we're in the fight or flight response. So digestion is going to be impaired if we're feeling really stressed. We will know when we feel uptight and really stressed, and we particularly probably don't want to eat. But when the stress is more subtle and potentially some of the more emotional sides of stress, where we're not so aware of it, or it's so part and parcel of our day-to-day life by being busy and overwhelmed, that we may not be aware how it's impacting our ability to digest food. All we do know is that we start to get digestive symptoms, and it's typically a sign of not eating in a relaxed manner because we're feeling quite stressed. So it affects our ability to digest food, and in turn this has a knock-on effect throughout the whole digestive tract. It can upset the gut microbiome, it can create dysbiosis, it can affect our bowel movements. So the whole gut can become really imbalanced. And not only is digestion poor, but just bear in mind, if you're not digesting food well, you're going to struggle to obtain the nutrients and absorb the nutrients into the bloodstream, having a bigger overall effect on our health. We can have an increased risk of infection. When cortisol is raised, it definitely impairs the immune system for several hours afterwards. So our white blood cell production can be impaired when we're particularly stressed. That may make us more prone to pick up more infections, more colds, more coughs, and struggle to fight them off. And finally, I just want to mention around inflammation. Now, it's considered that many of us are carrying around within us what we call low-grade inflammation, that's simmering away under the surface. And cortisol is considered to be pro-inflammatory when it is raised long-term. Very short-term responses to cortisol can be anti-inflammatory, but when it's longer term, it's considered to be pro-inflammatory. And we do need to bear in mind yet again that the stress can create poor dietary choices, and our poor dietary choices can be more pro-inflammatory to the body rather than anti-inflammatory. We may be eating more sugary foods, more processed foods, worse choice of fats in the diet, and all of these can be more pro-inflammatory, turning on that inflammatory response that doesn't get turned off. And of course, this can create more subtle ways of inflammation, maybe like irritating skin infections, for example. But of course, longer term inflammation in the body and inflammatory disease states could develop. For example, anything that ends in an itis, like arthritis, I'm not talking about the autoimmune conditions, but arthritis, these are all inflammatory disease processes that develop in the body through inflammation. And so I'd pay particular attention, of course, to dietary choices, but being aware how stress contributes to that. Now, I don't want this to be all doom and gloom. This is part of a two-part talk about stress for Stress Awareness Month. It is really important, though, that we do understand how stress plays a big impact on our overall health in our body in so many ways. I've highlighted just a few of them, and there are other ways that it can impact our health. Um, of course, nutritional status is important, but trying to find ways to manage it is also important. So the awareness, first and foremost, when we're aware, then we can start to think about, well, I do need to think of ways of how I can manage stress. And it's that I'm going to talk about next Tuesday night on my live. If you're watching this on my YouTube channel, my podcast, on my website, then please look out for my other talk video, which is my 5 naturopathic approaches to managing the stress response and to create calmness in the body. And if you're watching this live, thank you. And I'll be back next Tuesday night, which I think is the 11th of April, 23, to talk about how you can incorporate different things into your day-to-day life to really help you be proactive in managing stress in your lifestyle and doing everything you can to create a feeling of calm in the body. Thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you next week. Bye everyone, have a lovely week and have a lovely Easter too.